Welcome to my channel. In this video tutorial you're gonna see how I painted a Space Marine from the Iron Hands chapter. You will follow me in all the steps that took me from start to finish, and you'll see especially how I painted a black armor. So here's the model, all cleaned up, base coated with black primer from Vallejo. The first step was applying the base color to the armor plating. I used dark sea blue from Vallejo via the airbrush. It took several thin coats to get a solid finish, and I do this because when you paint black you don't actually want to be completely black, because you will not have any margin to darken and shade the model. And here you can see the model after the base color was applied. After the mid-tone dark sea blue was applied to the whole model, I created a first shade color, mixing black and dark sea blue on my wet palette. I started applying it, sketching the shades on the model. You don't need to be extremely precise, you just need to have an idea of where the lights and shadows are going to be. I'm starting from the shade because that's how I'm used to work. In this step, I don't actually look at all the tiny details of the model, for example these panel lines running across the leg, but I just look at the main volumes. So a leg is just a cylinder, the head is a sphere, and so forth. If there is one important thing to keep into account when applying this step, is that you want to make it so that your paint is smooth and you don't retouch while it's still wet on the model. You need to preserve the surface for the later stage. Once I was done with the first shade, I applied a second, darker tone, which is basically black with just a tiny touch of dark sea blue. I applied this tone in the same way of the previous one, but keeping the areas within the first shade color, making it deeper, trying to increase the contrast on the model. There are many different ways that one could go about painting something black. The main point is that you need to shift the color towards another tone. Don't just use black and white, it would be boring. And it's better to introduce a hue so that you can play with the atmosphere. So you can make the scene look cold if you're using blues and greens, or you can make it warm if you're using purples and reds. After placing all the shadows, I started sketching the highlights. First I mixed a highlight color using the dark sea blue, Celtic green and autumn green from scale 75 with a touch of white. You can see the color that I've mixed on screen. Once again, I just sketched the light position over the areas. Even in this case, I just consider the surfaces to be basic shapes and I imagine light from above hitting the model. One technique that I could recommend to use when figuring out where to place the lights and shadows on a miniature is to take a picture of it after you've primed it with a solid color, preferably black, under a strong light. Turn the picture black and white and save it for reference. You're gonna see the light hitting the model, basically where you should place your highlights and shadows. Because I'm painting black armor, I don't want the highlight colors to take too much surface on the model. They just need to be small. So the contrast needs to be sharp and the jump needs to be big from one tone to the other. So after a first highlight color, I am mixing a second one. As you can see, it's a very light lime green color. And I'm applying it with the same principle of the second shade. So I keep inside the first highlight areas and I keep the color thin, not applying very thick coat. For the iron hands, I was inspired from reference artwork that I've seen on their codex, and I like the idea of a cold yellow light enveloping, surrounding these soldier. So I chose to go for this yellow lime green tone. This step concludes the sketching of the lights and shadows for the armor and also the main part of this miniature. Here's the result. It's not a clean and smooth transition from one color to the other, but it's just a placement of these tones. So I can judge the overall shape and the overall contrast created. After you're happy with it, you move on to the blending. So this is what I'm doing right now. I'm gonna take my time. This is by far the longest step of all the painting process, and I blend all these transitions using mid-tone, placing it in a very thin coat over the two different colored areas. So for instance, right now I'm using dark sea blue to blend the tones from the first shade color to the first highlight color on a leg piece. Now I'm gonna show you the whole process on a knee pad. It's a small enough area that I can fit it into a short fragment of this video. It will take about 2 minutes, so you will see it all. I also left the palette into the frame so that you can see how I'm jumping from one color to the other. Now that the blending is complete, I am proceeding to block out all the areas that are not armor and that are going to be painted in different colors. So I'm just using black, applying in all the joints and all of those items that are going to be painted differently. So the eagle on the chest, the rifle, the little device in his left hand, and what else. I also do it because it's easier to judge the final result, which you can see right now on screen. All the blendings are done and I like the contrast on the miniature. Moving on to different items, I am painting the weapons. Decided to use an old foundation paint, Adeptus Battle Grey, to paint the Auspex, I think it's called, and the rifle casing. Even in this case, there is no particular trick to paint this part. It's just a solid layer for the following steps. Just use thin coats, thin paint, and put down a couple of layers if they're needed. I add Celestra Grey to the palette and I use it to give it a first light. So because these surfaces are smaller, there is the need of using a little bit of a thicker paint, because you don't want to apply multiple layers on such a small surface. It's going to be difficult. I'd rather use a fewer coats. So you can see how I did it, and I hope you can judge the consistency of the paint, how thick it is. This is a very good color, has very good covering properties. So I use it often when I need to paint something white. So these areas are very small and the jump from one tone to the other needs to be strong to get a nice result in the end. Moving on to the blending of these two tones, I'm using a mix of Celestra Grey and Adeptus Battle Grey to feather one color into the other. I'm also introducing a little bit of white to the mix to push the contrast a little bit more. Once again, I've made the decision of leaving a lot of this step into the video. It's my understanding that most people struggle with the blending of colors, both very dark and very light. So I hope that by seeing me doing it on screen, you can get a feeling of how it can be done. I know that there are many different ways to achieve a very good result, and possibly even better than mine. This is just a way that right now works for me. It's fairly quick, fairly easy, and so hope it's gonna be of some help to you watching the video. Now, it won't be an Iron Hand Space Marine if it didn't have a lot of iron on it. So on to painting the metals. Started out with a base coat of Vallejo Modular Gun Grey, which is an amazing color, I think, and it covers very well. It has very thin pigments and it has a particular shine once applied on a model. I am placing a solid layer. It's gonna take about 2 coats to have a very good and uniform coverage, and I am painting all those areas that are gonna be metallic in the end. Shoulder trims, the eagle on the chest, all the bits and pieces on the backpack, the weapons, and of course the hands. After I've achieved a solid look, I decided to use Vallejo Game Color Black ink to wash the surface, paying particular attention not to pull this ink all over, but just forcing it into the recessed areas. I'll prefer to use inks when using metallic pigments because I like the shine that they add to these areas, which is in line with the metallic look that one is trying to achieve, or at least with the one that I am trying to achieve. You can see that I just applied overall. You can see me doing mistakes, and you can fix them by using a touch of water with a clean brush. I gave the ink time to dry, and then I applied a first highlight color, Chainmail, from the old Citadel line. Even when I'm using the metallic pigments, I'm not actually changing the way that I'm painting. I'm applying them in the same way that I apply normal acrylics. So I will just sketch the shadows and sketch the highlights. So here I'm sketching these highlights over the metallic surfaces. The only care that I'm using is not to cover the deepest recesses because I just shaded them with the black ink. Also, if the areas are particularly small, like for instance over the chest eagle, you just need to use a little bit of a thicker paint, not to have it run all over the model, covering the details and flowing into the recesses. So just need to be a little bit careful and precise. I decided to push the contrast on the metals even more, applying a second highlight color, Mithril Silver, Old Citadel line once again. There is hardly the need to blend the metallic tones. All it takes is a little bit of dry brush to fade one tone into the other. So that's all that I did while painting this area. Once I was done placing this second highlight color, I just run the almost dry brush over the surface to fade the colors. And this is true unless you're painting a very small surface, like in this case on the eagle, where you just need to place the spots of light and there is no real need to blend the tones. They're already so small that there won't be any difference if you do. Now most of the model is complete. I just needed to paint a few minor details, apply Rhinoxide on the palette and used it to base coat the parchment for the purity seal. I also used it to wash over the pouches that he has on his belt that I painted with black and white. Mixing white and a little bit of the green to the Rhinoxide, I created a beige tone that I used to highlight the parchment. Normally I prefer to hand paint all the chapter symbols, but this particular one is so difficult and so geometrical that I decided to use decals. So the first step to do a decal application is to paint the surface with a glossy varnish. I used Coat from Citadel to paint all the shoulder pads. It takes a couple of coats to have a very smooth result, and this paint has a long drying time, so be patient. I picked a sheet from Forge World with all the Iron Hand symbols. chose my favorite ones and applied it. It's gonna be Clan Raukan and the Iron Hands symbols. You just dump it in water after you've cut it, and then with a brush you gently slide it onto the miniature. The glossiness of the surface is gonna help you move it around until you dry it out. Little trick is that if the surface is round, it might help if you cut a little bit of the side of the decal to help it fold a little bit better and run flat onto the surface. After the surface is dried from the water that you used to place the decal, you just cover it with a layer of lamium medium. I actually applied a couple of layers. This thing is gonna fix the decal in place and is gonna get rid of the glossiness of the art coat, making the surface dull as the rest of the model. One step that I didn't film is the next one, where I just applied a thin layer of dark sea blue over the decals to blend them into the painting, which also turns down a notch the white of the decals. Now on to the special effects. What I'm doing right now is mixing my pigments with some water and Vallejo glazing medium, using laser red day glow pigments from old Forge Monkey. The special effects are something that I'm finding myself playing a lot with lately. I really like the fact that it's something new that I haven't seen often over painted models. Placing them in the eyes to simulate glows from the lenses. I tried to change the application from previous models, controlling it a little bit more. I'm also placing it over the lenses on the rifle and the screen on the left-hand device. This step concludes this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you like the final result that you're about to see. Once again, thank you for watching. If you liked it, share and subscribe. This is the color list. Here is the final model, completed in all its glory. Hope I'm making all Iron Hands fan proud. Let me know down below in the comments what you think about it, and most of all, let me know what you want me to do next. See you all next time. Ciao!